Okay, so hi everybody. Very glad to have all of you joining us to the spring season of this book talk series called Spatial Practices in Chinese Art History and Visual Studies, organized by the Department of Chinese Culture of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So my name is Kathy Mack, Assistant Professor of the Department of Chinese Culture here at PolyU. Joining me organizing and hosting the talk this morning here in Hong Kong is my colleague, Pan Lu, Associate Professor in Cultural Studies, also from the same department of PolyU. So Lu and I had the idea of organizing this book talk series because for two major reasons. First, both of us are interested in the role of space, place, geography, and territory in the productions of art and also visual culture. So therefore, we have invited scholars who have recently published books on the subject to join us in the fall, in the fall and also in the spring now. And also, both of us are very eager to make use of video conferencing, this technology, to create an alternative platform for scholars and colleagues or friends who are interested in the subject to get together to learn about some of the major methodologies and also research approaches or questions that are involved in these questions. So we are very happy to have Elizabeth Kindall, who is Associate Professor of the Department of Art History at University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, joining us. And she's presenting her book called Geo-Narratives of a Filial Son, the Paintings and Travel Diaries of Huang Xiangjian, published by the Harvard University Asia Center in 2016. So Elizabeth, very nice to have you.
I would like to thank Kathy Mack and Lupan for inviting me to participate in this lecture series and Anquak for organizing it so beautifully. In today's talk, I will introduce the subject of my book project and examine the painting genre that is its focus. I will then tour you through some sample paintings that illustrate my points. Please note that two wonderful paintings I discuss are held in Hong Kong collections. The first you see here, which is in the Zhulalo collection of the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and the second is in the Beishan collection of the Art Museum of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. My book project began with an interest in the painter Huang Xiangjian. His life story reads like an adventure novel. He was the son of Huang Xiangjian, a degree candidate in Suzhou, one of the most prosperous and culturally preeminent cities of late in China. You see a sample of it there. If Huang Xiangjian did attempt the official examinations of the late Ming dynasty, like most young men of this period, he did not pass. In 1643, Huang Xiangjian was appointed district magistrate of Dayao in Yunnan, and his wife and nephew accompanied him to his post. The following year, the Ming dynasty fell, and in 1645, the city of Suzhou was controlled by the Manchu invaders. By this time, Huang had not heard from his parents for at least 8 years. Unsure whether they were alive or dead, Huang set out to find them in 1652. He traveled for 558 days over 2,800 miles, braving bandits, fierce minority tribes, man-eating tigers, disease-infested regions, and earthquakes. Despite almost impossible odds, he found his father and mother amidst the vast and mountainous province of Yunnan and brought them back home to Suzhou. We see his trajectory there. Within 3 years after his return, Huang Xiangjian had created a group of paintings picturing himself and his parents on this odyssey that offered viewers dramatic views of that rugged landscape in a detailed, awe-inspiring style. They were accompanied by a short inscription in which Huang identified the general vicinity of the site and his experience of it as he traveled through. Yet Huang never discussed his artistic training, standing, or impetus. Further, the majority of his extant dated paintings were produced within the 5 years after his return to Suzhou, although he was to live another 20 years. My initial question was, why? In order to answer this question, I grounded my study of Huang in 17th century Suzhou painting, particularly paintings of identifiable places. As I pursued the paintings Huang created in relation to the rich topographical painting tradition of Suzhou, it became clear to me that a tradition of place painting had gone unremarked by contemporary scholars. Topographical painting in China includes depictions of specific places in individual scenes, as well as depictions of journeys through landscape that involve several scenes, creating a panorama. Scholars of Chinese art have discussed topographical painting as religious, political, social, cultural, and stylistic narratives of their creators and audience. In his groundbreaking study, Richard Vinograd identified what he called landscapes of property, in which paintings might present serial views of the environs of the retreats of their painters. These environs were overlaid with personal references to the painter. Similarly, Li Cui Flora Fu has examined painted place paintings as a commemoration of the patron's travels and ambitions. In readings such as these, the painter or patron is the key player and narrative focus. The landscape, meanwhile, serves as the backdrop or intermediary sphere through which the focal persona voyages. Huang Xiangjian's oeuvre appeared to invert this priority. The focal persona in his work remains an important element of the painting, of course. However, his journey landscapes become active agents in the painting narrative. In this role, it is the landscape, not the focal persona, that narrates the journey and explicates its meaning. Again, this was not a unique phenomenon. Huang Xiangjian was creating and utilizing art for his own purposes, as he had seen done around him in Suzhou. I have labeled landscape journey paintings that lend themselves to this reading, such as those by Huang, Geo-Narratives, hence the title of my book. In the book, I aim to explain the concept of geo-narrative painting in relation to Huang Xiangjian and his oeuvre. What is geo-narrative painting? I argue that geo-narrative paintings are topographically specific landscapes that narrate the journey and ultimately create the meaning of the work. This landscape narration is achieved by presenting viewers with a series of specific topographical experiences within an identifiable area. The places illustrated in geo-narratives represent named sites and topography. These locations had accrued a range of historical, religious, and cultural connotations based on the activities, stories, and records of previous visitors. The layered histories of their topography offered painters and recipients a menu of qualities from which they could select to build their own experience and communicate particular meaning. In choosing specific topographic features, pathways, and views to build a journey, painters constructed certain experiences from this voluminous cultural menu. To guide the viewer through the constructed experiences of geo-narratives, representative figures are strategically placed within the picture. These painted figures engage in activities that highlight the topographical experiences illustrated. In addition, painters clarified the geo-narrative experience further through inscriptions that name the illustrated sites and elaborate on the painted topographical experiences. Paintings of this type relate a wide range of geographical experiences. They can narrate visits to specific scenic locations or tour viewers through groups of popular sites. The journeys they narrate guide viewers through specific site experiences that ultimately transform their understanding of these sites by revealing a deeper underlying meaning. The artists, subject matter, and styles of these paintings vary, but they all narrate a structured journey experience for viewers through an identifiable landscape whose significance and purpose is slowly revealed. The paintings Huang Xiangjian created of his remarkable journey to the wild Southwest illustrate the visual potential and functionality of the geo-narrative classification. Huang drew from the artistic devices and social strategies of his native Suzhou to formulate complex geo-narrative paintings. His painted self as traveler does not animate the routes described in these works. Rather, he employs the multidimensional symbolism and experiential knowledge he had gained of the famous and obscure sites and views of Southwest China through which he had traveled. The landscapes he painted move viewers through distinctive layers of topography and meaning to a transformative conclusion. Now, let's turn to some examples of geo-narrative paintings. Here, I will discuss two of these types. One geo-narrative type was painted for the public sector. The majority of Huang's paintings fit into this category. The second type was created for a more private select audience, the artist's father, Huang Xiangjian. And I will give you two examples of this second type. The Huang family arrived home penniless. Their possessions had been confiscated and all but the frame of their house destroyed. Friends and extended family most likely helped sustain them for a time. The question of how to survive long-term, however, must have troubled them greatly, just as it did so many families in this period. To remedy this situation, the family and their friends began a campaign to make known the filial and loyal actions of the Huang family. The evidence of this is the publication of Huang's travel diaries and his production of numerous paintings of his arduous travel to the southwest and the equally arduous return of the whole family. The ultimate goal of the campaign was to achieve the title of filial son for Huang Xiangjian. Filial sons were granted gifts of rice, money, government appointments, and a host of social benefits. The majority of Huang Xiangjian's extant paintings present tangible evidence of this campaign and visualize him as a filial son. This body of paintings serves as the first type of geo-narrative painting. Huang's geo-narrative paintings present his transformation into a filial son. The geo-narratives Huang created used the geography of his Southwest Odyssey to narrate his filiality. The landscape itineraries Huang created synchronize with the basic components found in his writings and celebrated by the friends who wrote colophons and prefaces to his published diaries. These align with the structure of a classic filial piety tale. As in classic filial piety narratives, Huang presents landscape imagery in his paintings to introduce his character, narrate his filial acts, and suggest the rewards of these acts. The character of a filial son is the foundation of any filial piety narrative. Huang presents this pictorially through his juxtaposition of tiny representations of himself, contending with the natural, social, and political elements of his journey. His figure's movement through the challenge conveyed in each painting leaves little doubt of his character. Each leaf illustrates Huang alone on the way to Yunnan, as we see here, or the Huang family on their return amidst the perilous circumstances and strange sights they encountered en route, primarily in Guizhou and Yunnan. The short inscriptions Huang wrote in the upper corners of his paintings further magnify the danger and emotion of each illustrated episode. They also highlight his pictorial representations of his filial character through discussions of his filial thoughts, references to his filial actions, and quotations from classic filial texts. In addition to character, the actions of a filial son are a primary element of a filial piety tale. Huang's paintings dramatically narrate his filial acts. The true goal of these works was to narrate his filiality, not recreate his itinerary. Huang created geo-narrative representations of the types of filial acts he performed on his Odyssey. His albums present these filial acts as a synchronic record, with each leaf becoming its own geo-narrative of his journey toward filiality. 10 basic filial acts are represented in these works. Huang is seen to climb treacherous mountains, ford rushing rivers, as you see on your right, and cross frighteningly deep chasms at your left, trek through dangerous flora and suffer miserable weather, as suggested by these two leaves, confront menacing animals such as the troops on elephants in the left and soldiers who are said to guard this iron bridge on the right, native peoples, as suggested by these mountaintop villages pictured, to seek shelter in other villages, and to attempt not to lose his way. He then faces it all again on the journey home, except more slowly, with the additional concern of transporting his elderly parents in palanquins, as we see there. The inscriptions that accompany each painting highlight and further define the 10 basic categories of filial acts Huang pictures. To attain the filial son title, Huang could not be conventionally filial. Basic Confucian precepts required every member of society to be filial, but only the most filial would be rewarded with an official title. Therefore, Huang had to be, as the family friend Li Kai-shu stated, the filial son of filial sons. To do so, Huang couches his journey as a heroic odyssey, attempted by few during the dynastic transition and completed by himself alone. Hero tales of this type were popular in the 17th century, and the active hero was increasingly celebrated during the Ming-Qing transition in life and in literature. Huang presents himself as heroically filial in these paintings by building up a landscape of extreme obstacles that he and his family had to overcome. He emphasizes the immediacy of their predicaments and the actions they took in response. Nearly insurmountable natural elements, massive mountain ranges, rough terrain, flooding streams, malarial mists, and drenching rains dominate each scene. Amidst these natural difficulties are details suggesting dangerous human interactions, such as the villages of feared minority tribes and soldiers mounted on elephants. Huang placed the primary challenge of each episode prominently in the middle to lower foreground. Huang set extremely small figures of himself and his family within this overwhelming landscape as we see there. These tiny figures serve as foils to the dangerous obstacles in which they are enmeshed and enhance the staggering effect of the southwestern scenery. Regardless, the small figures of Huang and his family move ever forward through this all-encompassing terrain. Huang always depicts them in action, and the majority of this movement is either physically or psychologically intense. The figure of Huang climbs steep mountains and fords rushing rivers. He hikes through intensely stressful and mentally overwhelming situations like the elephant cavalry and iron bridge checkpoint at the Guizhou-Yunnan boundary. He faces the strange, sublime vistas of the Southwest. Huang heightened the action further by literally activating the landscape proper. The landscape of each scene presents the immediacy of each predicament. It surrounds and envelops Huang and his family in the pivotal moment of action, which is also described in the inscriptions. In Li Peak Station, which we see here, Huang illustrates how he climbed up the Guansuo Range on a long, narrow, and winding path, a twisting path amidst 1,000 peaks, very near the point of total exhaustion. Again and again, Huang paints himself and his party midway through a mountain range or in the center of a river. When he is not mid-stride, he is about to begin, as we see here, and he is on his way to make his path through these very frightening animals, which appear to be ferocious deer. The landscape compositions Huang created intensify the action of each scene. One strong diagonal usually dominates each composition and moves the eye swiftly through the major elements of the scene. In the Qinglong military station town leaf, the viewer reads the inscription, then moves down the wild waterway, past the outcropping of cliff to Huang's dangerous river crossing in the foreground. The clarity and strength of these diagonals continuously push the eye on to the next active form within the composition. The animated sections of landscape that form these diagonals also appear to move and shift before the viewer's eyes, actively twisting and curving. The looming precipice that we see here was a particular favorite of him and occurs in a plethora of episodes. A variety of events indicates the transformative effect of Huang's geo-narrative paintings as part of the Huang family campaign. Nationally, the Huang family story was recognized as a heroic filial piety tale when it was dramatized by Li Yu in the play called Yunnan over 10,000 Li. It was also recognized by prominent Qing officials, such as Liang Qingbiao, a Ming loyalist sympathizer who wrote a Yuefu poem about its performance. Imperial recognition of Huang as filial son was probably achieved in 1705 under the Kangxi Emperor. During his southern tour, the Huang family friend Zhou Danling reports in a colophon that a Huang Xiangjian painting was presented to the Kangxi Emperor at this time as evidence of his filiality. The success of this petition for imperial recognition of Huang's filial status resulted in the erection of a monument to Huang soon after his death. It was a pillar to filial son Huang that stood at the entrance of Liu Guo's lane in his hometown of Suzhou. The pillar is no longer extant. This is just an example of what it might have looked like. Today, it is his geo-narrative paintings that proclaim his reputation for filiality. The second type of geo-narrative Huang created was geared toward a more private, select audience. Indeed, its core audience was one individual, Huang Xiangjian's father, Huang Hongjiao. I would like to give you two examples of this type of painted geo-narrative. The first example is a hand scroll illustrating Mount Jizu. It is in the Beishan collection in the Art Museum of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. At first glance, the work appears to be a typical landscape scroll consisting of unidentified land, forms, caves, pavilions, and overlooks. But a closer look reveals it also contains 31 constructed and natural landmarks, identified in small characters, and a lengthy inscription by the artist at the end. The painting opens with a bustling fishing village at the end of an expansive lake. A small spit of land and the route of a crowded sailboat convey viewers to the opposite shore. Here, we find heavily cultivated, village-laden areas of fantastic rock formations, roiling mountains, and cloudy waterways. Three figures preparing to cross a covered bridge stand at the periphery of the second half of the hand scroll. They enter a region boasting even higher, more jagged peaks and sheer rocky outcroppings. In this section, monasteries and pavilions nestled amidst alpine foliage offer views of spectacular waterfalls and distant, multicolored mountain summits emerging through clouds and mist. A harrowing bridge and vertiginous stairs lead viewers to the culminating point of the hand scroll, the pagoda at its peak. Though the descent down the opposite side of this peak is faintly suggested, the underlying bank of snowy mountains moves the viewer's eye from the pagoda directly across the composition to the lengthy closing inscription by the artist. In this painting, the experiential intensity of this painted journey was determined by one's geographical knowledge of the mountain proper. Although a variety of audiences could appreciate the Mount Jizu journey, the only person who could experientially interpret every aspect of the hand scroll was the father of the artist. Every element of the hand scroll bespeaks Huang Hongjiao. He had both the knowledge of the mountain and personal experience climbing it necessary to read it as a geo-narrative. This is because the transformative experiences of this particular geo-narrative requires a spatial realization. The entirety of the painting is structured to represent a daguan, or grand view, of the Mount Jizu region. The grand view represents a panoramic view from an elevated place that metaphorically implies the comprehensive understanding achieved by certain enlightened individuals. I would like to sketch out the major components Huang used to create this geo-narrative and how they worked together to create this special meaning for his father. Huang Xiangjian presents an idyllic mountain district within the area of his father's former official duties and traces a route through the sites of most interest to his father's cultural group. The 31 constructed and natural landmarks Huang identified in small characters designate a specific itinerary through the painted landscape. The labels and sites along this itinerary could simulate the physical act of travel by encouraging the viewer to stop and appreciate each identified locality as though literally journeying through it. This same presentation of the journey experience is found in travel narratives and records of the time. These texts present landscape journeys as linked descriptions of individual sites along a specific route or set of routes. Traditional mountain gazetteers, too, are organized as categorical lists of sites, such as monasteries, shrines, waterways, and rock formations. Huang included several well-known spots on the mountain, such as Dragonflower Monastery, which is seen here. These were illustrated in printed books, such as Yang Arzong's Strange Views Within the Four Seas of 1609. Travel writers such as Wang Shixing and Xiedongshan in the 16th century also mention some of the sites labeled in the painting. A particularly favorite anecdote was the harrowing final climb up the steep and treacherous monkey stairs to the summit. In addition to this famous natural scenery, Huang also labeled a number of the most well-known man-made structures on the mountain, such as Dragonflower and the Kashapa monasteries. My examination of these sources and on-site research suggest that the places Huang chose to label were a mixture of celebrated sites and lesser-known, rarely recorded spots. Several sites, such as Yang Cave, are rarely identified in other contemporary travel writings and gazetteers. Mount Jizu, as a whole, presents the most symbolic and beautiful scenery within the area Huang Hongjiao had governed as district magistrate of Daliao. Huang Xiangjian provides a personalized route through 31 constructed and natural landmarks to the top of Mount Jizu. These sites represent the tastes of a Confucian gentleman interested in Buddhism. This also describes his father, Huang Hongjiao. Even the connotations of the mid-scroll watermill augment the Buddhist persona of the mountain. From the Northern Song onward, the movement of the watermill was used as a metaphor for the eternal turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And it became a visual pun to transform the mechanical movement of the water wheel into the spiritual power of the Buddha. Huang utilized a style with which his father was familiar. Huang illustrated many of the labeled sites by accentuating one or two of their most identifiable traits. This was a common technique utilized by painters of the famous places in his hometown of Suzhou. The famously precarious cliffs of Shatang, for example, were described by the 16th century writer Xiedongshan as stones that were formed into lofty arches and looked as though they were about to fall. Huang rendered them as two looming rocks over a miniature passerby. Similarly, Huang encapsulates the Dragonflower Monastery by portraying its main temple building and deep pine forest in this way as suggested by Wang Shixing, described as the 10,000 pines, that beautifully filtered sunlight for which it was known. With a profusion of red speckles, Huang represents the fields of exotic flowers, a flower domain that had so inspired Li Yuanyang that he devoted an entire essay to his experience of them. Huang also included experiential renderings of sites with which Huang Hongjiao would have been personally familiar. This too was a common practice amongst Suzhou site painters. This unique technique organized the topography and architectural elements of sites to recreate the visitor's experience of them. Huang suggests select geographical curiosities on Mount Jizu in this way. These subtle topographical renderings of the mountain would have been understood by someone who had personally visited the mountain, such as Huang Hongjiao. He had the experiential knowledge necessary to visualize the unillustrated implications of certain sites. For example, although Huang capably renders the precipitous monkey stairs that we have seen, he obscures the memorably steep steps visitors ascend to reach the Kashapa monastery behind a wall of rocks, as we see here. These are only slightly alluded to by Wang Shixing, who reports that he clambered up to Kashapa Hall to pay my respects to the image of that worthy. And here we see the monastery steps on the left as they've been recreated, not the original steps, but they are still quite steep. The hot spring of Zhongdong Pond serves as another example. Although it is labeled, it is completely unillustrated. Only an inviting cloud of steam to the right of the label intimates its presence. It too is not described in written records. Huang personalizes the journey still further by joining his father in painted form on the climb. Throughout the painting, several figures are depicted appreciating the sights and views of the Mount Jizu vicinity. Garbed in light-colored scholars' robes, they gaze about and point appreciatively. Embedding observers within imaginary or site-specific landscape paintings was a well-established trope by Huang Xiangjian's time. The two robed figures preparing to cross Xishan Bridge, however, are more distinctively attired. One is dressed in a light blue robe, the other in a red robe. These two figures are the primary visitors to the mountain. These two appear at 5 different locations on the mountain. They sit atop Filial cliff and look off into the distance. They scurry beside the waterfall at Qishan Ravine. They gaze into the dragon pool outside Haihui Monastery. And they admire the impressive view of the summit pagoda from below. As we know, Huang Xiangjian inevitably includes himself in his paintings. In Mount Jizu, Huang places both himself and his father, actively appreciating the natural surroundings within the painting, and they climb the mountain together. Huang composed the picture to recreate the experience of the climb as a whole. This too would have been evident only to someone who had ascended the mountain, such as his father. The pictorial synopsis of a journey was another common device of Suzhou painters. Climbing the 3,240-meter-high mountain was a long and difficult endeavor, as noted by the majority of writers who attempted it. Even today, with the help of newly laid cement stairs, it takes several hours. For those in the know, Huang cleverly exploited the hand scroll format to relate this arduous climb visually. The first half of the scroll encompasses the 104 kilometers from the Lake district to the base of Mount Jizu. This is represented by Cleanse the Heart Bridge a little over midway through the scroll. The second half of the hand scroll illustrates the vertical ascent of Mount Jizu from this bridge. The height of the mountain is only about 1/32 of the distance to the mountain from our lake, but the steep climb certainly makes the two distances feel comparable. Hence, Huang divides his illustration of these two distances evenly over the scroll. He equates the easier, though lengthier trek to the base of Mount Jizu with the physical exertion and time required to climb to the summit. His formula would have been understood only by an experienced Southwest traveler like Huang Xiangjian. He alone would realize Huang's depiction for what it was, an experiential illustration of the duration of the trip. This did not become clear to me until I too had traveled to the base of the mountain in one day and then took another whole day to climb it. And there I'm not as close as I thought I was. Many steps to go. One gains an extraordinary view from the mountain summit. Huang describes it at the end of his inscription, stating, "From the top of the pagoda was a dazzling view of the 1,000 peaks and myriad ravines of the Nanjiao kingdom. The billowing colors of green and blue were indescribable. Then, when I gazed westward, there were the mountains that looked like a jade dragon, stretching forward unbroken 1,000 li. It was marvelous and extraordinary." The topography and composition Huang painted relate the beautiful but arduous climb to the top of the mountain. The inscription that concludes the scroll further amplifies the sight experience. It also takes the reader on a second trek up the mountain. Again, the inscription, like the painting, ends with a view from the top. A final element of the geo-narrative experiential reading is activated here, where the other two readings end. This is where Huang presents his father with a transformative grand view. It was Huang Xiangjian's experience of the topography of Mount Jizu that transformed the pictorial and literary descriptions of the journey through the landscape into an enlightened, comprehensive view of the site and experience as a whole. It relied on his personal knowledge of the view from the highest vantage point atop the summit, as well as his ability to visualize the journey in its entirety. From ancient times, writers utilized the term grand view as a condensed expression of all that a panoramic view from an elevated place implied. Evolving from its earliest appearance in the ancient Book of Changes, or I Ching, over time, the term grand view became a metaphor for the comprehensive understanding achieved by uniquely enlightened individuals. Huang's grand view of Mount Jizu relied on an experiential knowledge of the view from the summit that could not be attained from literary descriptions or printed renderings of the site. Although reports of the view from the summit existed in 17th century works, they were vague and confused. The book Strange Views Within the Four Seas, for example, erroneously groups our lake, the Diansong Mountains, and the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains together in the upper left corner of the illustration. Travel records and gazetteer descriptions of the mountain's topmost view were often equally confused, and their authors did not distinguish it from another outlook. One gains a clear conception of two geographical entities visible from the top of Mount Jitsu, our lake to the southwest and the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains to the northwest. They were both visible when I arrived at the summit. Only atop the summit did I realize how Huang had incorporated these two topographical entities into the painted hand scroll. The impressive expanse of our lake to the southwest begins the hand scroll, while the jagged white terrain of the Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains to the northwest of Mount Jitsu concludes it. Our lake measures 40 kilometers from north to south and covers an area of 246 square kilometers. The Jade Dragon Snowy Mountains rise 5,596 meters above sea level. The large size of these two massive geographical formations makes them quite visible, yet there is only one place where one can see both: the summit of Mount Jitsu. From here, one can take in a grand view of them. Even more significant is the pictorialization of the Mount Jitsu grand view. It is only from atop Mount Jitsu that one can obtain complete views of both. Huang Xiangjian knew the implications of his son's composition. The view from the pagoda at the hand scroll's end implies the view of the place the hand scroll began at our lake, and by extension, all that lies in between, the grand view. This is the transformative experience and message of this painted geo-narrative. Huang Xiangjian also painted my last example of a geo-narrative for his father. Over the summer of 1658, Huang painted a large 8-leaf landscape album in ink and color on paper that I will refer to here as the Yunnan album. It's an abbreviation of its frontispiece, as you see there. The original title of the album is unknown. 6 of its leaves depict sites in Yunnan, one captures a region of Guizhou, and another describes the scenery of the Guizhou-Huang border. The transformative experience of this geo-narrative album is the realization that it presents a pictorial biography of the artist's father. Huang's body of work transformed him into a filial son. The Mount Jitsu painting narrated his father's enlightened grand view. This set of paintings was also done for his father. They narrate Huang Xiangjian's transformation over the course of his life. They capture Huang's father's lifelong journey toward sagehood. The iconic landscape elements that compose and inhabit the physical topography of the Yunnan album represent a multitude of themes and sub-themes. Each embodies one facet of the personality of an ideal 17th century gentleman, such as Huang Xiangjian, recluse, loyalist, landscape observer, traveler, philosopher, and official. Collectively, they capture the essential beliefs by which the life of a gentleman was defined. Figures engaged in classic gentlemanly activities imbued with the broadly accepted symbolism of intellect, principle, and cultivated awareness are a focal point in each leaf. A figure in red admires the feeder spring to the hot springs pictured in this leaf. Gentlemen pictured beside waterfalls exemplified wisdom. They literally reenacted the famous statement from the Confucian Analects: the wise find pleasure in water, the virtuous find pleasure in hills. Here, a figure sits quietly in a small hut built into the entrance of a cave. A deer curled up asleep in front of the cave implies the meditative calm of the moment. Deer are associated with the deer park of the Buddha and with monastery grounds generally, so they may symbolize a place of meditation to enlightenment. Here, 2 figures stand beside a waterfall and exhibit their erudition by discussing some natural formation or cliff inscription on the rock face beside them. In this leaf, 2 gentlemen converse as they walk beneath the pines of Mount Taihua. For centuries, men had been pictured conversing or listening to the wind in the pines. The act of listening to the wind stirring amidst pines could symbolize their refined and contemplative sensibilities. Gentlemen were also equated with the long-lived strength and vitality of the trees themselves. Like these evergreens, the principal gentleman was constant, no matter the political weather or wind. In addition to this generalized iconography, Huang Xiangjian integrated topography infused with the very specific experiences, beliefs, and memories of his father. For example, the album presents the topography of Huang Kongjiao's general realm of governance. Another example may be seen in the way that Huang Xiangjian intertwines the life experiences of Huang Kongjiao with the eminent philosopher he admired, Wang Yangming. This is done a variety of ways, but the most obvious can be found in the sunrise of this leaf. Huang Xiangjian reports in his travel diaries that toward dawn on 1653, near Weiqing, he and his family passed through the area pictured, and his father wrote an elegy for Wang Yangming. Huang Xiangjian summons an image of Wang Yangming through his depiction of the sunrise at this site. Yangming means sunlight or sun-like brilliance, and Huang allows his father to travel amidst a landscape colored by the rosy glow of his icon. The personal topography Huang Xiangjian painted also presents Buddhism as a focal element in his father's life, which is emphasized in the travel diaries also. The overarching Buddhist focus of this leaf is evident, yet its exact importance to Huang Kongjiao remains unclear. This is indicative of several leaves that include privileged content that appears to have been known only to Huang and his father. The leaf inscription identifies the old Buddhist monastery and pagoda of Mount Luomin, or Brahman, as the site depicted in this leaf. It was located in western Yunnan, near the banks of the Lancang River. The remote location and treacherous terrain of this mountain did little to promote it as one of the scenic sites of Yunnan. Hence, its inclusion here suggests it was important to its recipient. Perhaps Huang Kongjiao considered the ancient Luomin monastery to maintain a particularly strong link to the religious holy land of Buddhism, India. The Lancang River did indeed provide a direct connection with India, for its upper tributary flows into Yunnan from India, while its lower tributary, the Mekong River, flows on into Myanmar. There are countless circumstantial, religious, historic, and scenic reasons why Huang Kongjiao may have favored the Luomin monastery, but his son does not identify one. In the end, it remains a privileged memory available to Huang Kongjiao alone. In this geo-narrative, the individual leaves work together. This painting consists of 8 independent trips in regions of the Southwest, but when read together, they form the spiritual biography of Huang Kongjiao's journey toward sagehood. The goal of adulthood for many 17th century gentlemen like Huang Kongjiao was the continual process of self-realization toward becoming a person, Changran, as opposed to the static Western conception of a completed growth process. The self was believed to have virtually unlimited potential for development, and maturation was a lifelong process. Selfhood, although sought by the person, was perceived as part of the larger scheme of humanity. The ultimate self-transformation of Confucian religiousness incorporated both critical moments of enlightenment in a person's life, as well as their continuous progress toward the spiritual cultivation of this wisdom. Those deemed successful were called sages. Many 17th century gentlemen sought sagehood. They were aided in these endeavors by texts like Reflections on Things at Hand by Zhu Xi and Lu Duqian, which contained the author's thoughts on the development of sagehood. The final chapter on the dispositions of sages and worthies also contains biographies of those who partially or fully realized sagehood. Biography was an important element of Confucian spiritual development. Ming Dynasty writers were particularly interested in examining their progress in matters of self-cultivation and recorded their pursuits in works such as Gao Panlong's autobiography, Recollections of the Toils of Learning, and Hu Zhi's autobiography of the same name. Between 1565 and 1680, a number of gentlemen chose to present their lifelong progress towards sagehood in the form of a travel narrative. Wu Peiyi has labeled the result of this textual blending spiritual autobiography. Most spiritual autobiographies include a significant initial experience, visiting sites associated with sages and worthies, periods of physical danger and extreme hardship, ascents to great heights, and breakthroughs to unsurpassed topographical views. Most importantly, these were double journeys in which people climbed physically, and this was accompanied by spiritual progress. The hazardous ascent brought the seeker to a salient point where a sudden illumination struck him. In the Dianan album, Huang Xiangjian presents a pictorial spiritual biography, rather than autobiography, for his father. Huang moves the viewer through the significant historical, cultural, and personal topography of Huang Kongjiao's lifelong quest for sagehood as he travels through the physical geography of 8 distinct southwest areas. The path of each expedition mirrors the strenuous upward locomotion accompanying spiritual progress. In addition, 6 of the 8 leaves suggest or illustrate the view available from a great height, indicative of the significant moment, following a dangerous ascent in which a sudden illumination strikes the seeker. Huang Xiangjian links the 8 journey stages of the Dianan album into one spiritual biography by integrating himself into each leaf. A pictorial Huang travels through every site in his usual blue robe. His painted self identifies the path of each leaf, experiences the natural geography, observes the human activities, and signals the gradual upward trajectory of the journey as a whole. He begins along the Li River bank in Li 1. He finishes by admiring the distant view in the last leaf. His general trajectory begins in the far right of the first leaf at the lowest geographical elevation represented in the album. He finishes at the far left on a high precipice at the end of the last leaf. Huang's painted self acts as observer, narrator, and biographer as he journeys through the life landscape of his father. Huang proceeds towards 2 gentlemen chatting beneath or listening to the wind in the pines. He has passed one gentleman admiring the spring and one or several gentlemen bathing in the hot spring. He will emerge from the cliffs of Jianchuan to look out onto distant travelers making their way toward the city. He passes above 2 gentlemen admiring some aspect of the cliffs of Heqing. Huang Xiangjian is present as these figures reenact the life events and beliefs of his father. I would suggest that one of the figures, who often wears a red robe, in each of these interactions represents his father, but Huang does not interact with these figures. Indeed, he could not, for they exist in another time and place. They emphasize the interests, beliefs, and personal experiences of his father. Huang employed the final leaf as both the moment of spiritual enlightenment and final sagehood for his father. This scene also serves as his historical commentary to the entire album. In this leaf, the painted figure of Huang sits on a high precipice admiring an endless chain of mountains that progresses into the horizon. A red-robed figure enters a monastery below. Huang Kongjiao, as the figure in red, may be seen to attain the moment of sagehood here. The figure of Huang sits on the plateau above the monastery. This is the only leaf in which Huang is not on the move. Instead, he sits contemplating the grand view that concludes the album. Having traveled through this geo-narrative of his father's life and accomplishments in Yunnan, Huang reaches this enlightened vantage point and now views them in their entirety. It is to this type of transformative experience that all geo-narratives aspire, if we as viewers will seek them. Thank you.
I very much appreciate your paper and also the very beautiful PowerPoint that you have produced, because after listening to your presentation, not only I want to read the book more carefully, but I also want to rush to the Art Museum of CUHK and also the Hong Kong Art Museum here to check out Huang's painting. And I'm sure a lot of us want to go to Yunnan once the international travel is available after the pandemic. All right. So let me please maybe let me pose the first question, and my colleague Dr. Pan will also join us after my question. So I would like to follow your major argument, geo-narrative, because I think this is a very interesting concept. The idea that the portrayal of landscape, a place's site, can produce a narrative itself. So some of us may know that scholars in film study or literature also have investigated the idea of narratology, basically the idea of studying narrative. So I was struck by your presentation, because especially the two types of geo-narrative that Huang Xiangjian has produced. The first one is for the public, satire, the album leaf that she has produced, in which she has utilized mostly monochrome ink, and also very brief and very minimalist, very hasty brushwork to depict a specific scene that he has chosen to narrate his journey to the West. And you have mentioned it's actually in your book that it's possible that he was creating some sketch during the trip. Is that what you have talked about in the book, right? But for the second, the hand scroll that you have talked about, that Huang Xiangjian produced for his father, the kind of brushwork, the style of the painting changed dramatically. Not only he has utilized ink and color on paper, specifically he was engaging the tradition of blue and green landscape, but also he sometimes utilized some of the brushwork that evokes viewers' memory of painting manners of classical painting masters, such as Jinhao, Juran, Dongran, the kind of hand fiber brushwork, the way of depicting mountain tops. So I was wondering why he demonstrates such a switch when he created the hand scroll for his father, and also the landscape that he produced for that, produced in that hand scroll somehow is idealized, beautify the landscape surrounding mountain Jizhu, right? Seems like the kind of message being projected is very different from the album, a sense of danger, precarious journey, whereas the second one is very beautiful. So I was wondering if you can talk more about the two types of styles being used, and especially the statement, the sentiment, being able to project it in the second work.
Sure. It is wonderful to have someone look as closely at Huang's work as I have, and I appreciate your comments so much. It's a wonderful question. The idea of the black and white, just working in that black and white, that very ink, the very ink monochrome that he works in, I think that gives it an immediacy, and it gives it almost a sketch-like quality, although we know it was not sketched on the trip. But I think that lends it an immediacy, a sketched kind of a feel to it that he was seeking, and reinforces the idea that this is me, this is what the trip was like. It was harrowing. It was, there were so many things that happened to me, dramatically on the trip. Whereas the color paintings, both of those are in very much a green and blue style, right? And that is literally the way that a Chinese painter would say once upon a time, right? Long ago in a paradisical land, in the land of the immortals, it has this kind of idyllic paradisical quality to it. And because those were made for his father, I think that he is honoring his father by placing him in that more beautiful, idyllic blue and green tradition. It also has an archaic feel to it, right? So he places him within that kind of legendary flavor of the blue and green. I think that a lot of the brushwork that he uses is similar over the course of both the ink paintings and the paintings that he did for his father. I mean, he does have a very significant and specific style, but I do believe that he works to make the style feel in the ink paintings, again, more quickly done and sketch-like. Whereas, as you say, he might be alluding to certain, more archaic brushwork in those two, again, honoring his father, placing his father within that traditional framework of painters that his father would appreciate and acknowledge and recognize. So those are just a few ideas. I hope I'm kind of getting to an answer for you.
I guess the idea of honoring his father is also an act of filial, piety, and additional way to demonstrate it. Yes. So let's see if my colleague, Dr. Pan, has any question.
Oh, hi, Professor Kindall. Thank you very much. Despite the difficulty, thank you so much for complete this wonderful talk. I'm more in the field of visual culture in the contemporary world. So this period is very unfamiliar for me, but I found it so interesting because the two, like Kathy was talking about the difference between the black and white and the color painting. My feeling at first sight is the first part is so much like the storyboard of a film, and then the second part is the entire film. That he, after all these accumulation and also these, maybe fragmented and scattered experience, and he finally can finish a full-length color film in the end. So that's really my first reaction, and I never expected to see this in the ancient artworks, and so I found it fascinating. And also, you talk about this. So my question would be maybe more about this, actual geographical difference and this travel, what this travel mean, or in that particular historical context, because you also mentioned this term qiguan. I think it's also very important for this second type of painting. So you translate it into strange view. So that really the Chinese word qiguan. Today in my visual studies, actually it's usually a translation of spectacle. So we usually translate spectacle into qiguan. So that's also I think very much related to how this literati, this artist from one of the most the prosperous and the cultured cities in the in China. I mean, in how would you call that? It's not the central, but at least it's not the frontier or the borderland. And he traveled all the way to this quite exotic landscape in Yunnan. And so today we will maybe just use that term spectacle, but at that time it might be something else. So I'm very interested in, as I'm also working on a project about Hainan, and so I'm really interested in how do you think in his paintings this this spectacle, this strange view, this exoticness is also very much integrated in his creation. Yeah, that's my.
All right. So how is this spectacle integrated into his creation? This was a real question for me, and he is an interesting combination of factors. I think of him as a Ming painter. He's listed as a Qing painter, right? But he grew up in Ming Suzhou. So he's surrounded constantly, and that is what the first chapter of my book deals with, by paintings of places of Suzhou. Suzhou was one of them, we all know, under heaven there is Suzhou and Hangzhou, right? I mean, it's this beautiful place. And so the topography of Suzhou was very well known, topographical paintings were very well known. And so I see him as borrowing in a very, very clever way from topographical painting types and functions that were common in Suzhou. So he he saw the way these functioned and he used them for his own purposes, not only because that was what he knew, but also because that is what his father and his well, I wouldn't say patrons, but people that he was seeking to impress with the paintings, that is what they knew as well. And they knew how to read that. But then how do you translate that, as you're asking, into the marvelous or the spectacular, right? And I think that he does that a variety of ways. You know, one is by kind of creating his own form of kind of miniature monumental painting, we might say, you know, these album leaves or these hand scrolls where his figures are so tiny and the landscape is just overwhelming, right? And as opposed to, say, the paintings of Wu Bin or Chen Hongshou or someone like that in the late Ming, his landscape still makes sense. You know, it's Ming, and there's a spectacular, but the spectacular nature of it is the mountains just go on and on and on, right? And that's really Yunnan, is for people that have been, you know, and that's why I try to bring in those actual pictures, right? So he's balancing out capturing what he sees and his remembrances of that, you know, be it an iron bridge or be it 5 soldiers on elephants or, you know, these mountains that go on forever. And he's integrating these spectacular elements of topography into the very formulaic painting of Suzhou that he grew up with. And I think that makes it, and forgive me, I'm a very function-oriented person, but I think that makes his work very functional. And I say this as a compliment. You know, he was able to appeal to, I think, a very diverse audience. You know, people could read it and yet see it as spectacular at the same time. Have I answered your question at all, Dr. Panlu? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure.
Because of the sake of time, maybe let's just encourage the audience to share the question. You can either type your question in the chat box or maybe raise your hand so that our project assistant can unmute you. You can talk to our speaker directly, all right? Maybe while we are waiting, I also have a question to ask. So you have mentioned that the first album, the work, was targeting the public sector. So I was wondering, in the 17th century, how was this particular album produced by Huang Xiangjian being able to be circulated to the public?
Yes, that's an excellent question. You know, I think that this was very much a campaign. So the paintings that he created were created in tandem with his diaries. And he wrote an entire diary of his journey to Yunnan, and then the fundraising tours that he took within Yunnan to raise money to bring his parents back to Suzhou. And so he wrote a diary of the journey back to Suzhou as well. So he wrote these diaries, and these were printed up with colophons at the end of them by good friends of his that talked about his character, that talked about his journey, talked about his dedication and filiality, as well as prefaces that talked about that. So those were printed, to my understanding, and circulated widely and spoken of. And then he created these paintings. And the albums, the ink albums that I think were particularly part of this campaign, I believe that they were made probably as gifts to specific people. One of the interesting things about these is there are no inscriptions dedicating them to people, which makes me think that perhaps he created them on bulk. You know, he was making them and giving them as gifts, and he could have inscribed them and we could have lost the inscriptions as well. But these were a more kind of personal way, right, to spread the tale of his journey. And so he would make these as albums, and I suggest give them as gifts to various people. And one of the reasons that I think he was doing this in bulk is that bulk is a little bit of an overcharacterization. He made quite a few of them. You know, there are several albums that are quite similar. And that's one of the reasons that I think he was doing this. He creates them in this 5-year span of time. And as I showed you, say with the 3 different paintings of villages or Li Peak, a lot of the compositions are very, very similar, right? So he was taking compositions, this is the high peak composition, or this is the minority village on a mountain composition. And he was creating them, and sometimes it's the same place and sometimes it is not. So, there are, as I said in the talk, these are representative sites and scenes of Yunnan, and he had them in his mind, and he was able to create them. I would say, I don't think that was incredibly quickly done, but he efficiently done so that he could spread them. And then these were spread amidst specific social groups and spread his name in another way. And so I think all of this worked together as part of the campaign.
That's very helpful. It's very helpful to think about the circulation and reception of artwork in the form of a social campaign, because I think this day scholars are starting to pay more attention to the role of audience. For instance, the publication by Craig Clunas and also by Tiansheng as Suzhou, right? So I think the relationship between artwork and audience in a social environment, we do need to look at this kind of question more closely, right? So
I think that's really an excellent. Well, I'm sorry. It's really an excellent way, I think, of proving our worth as art historians. I think that by looking at the art, we can very much recreate a different type of social history that's not available to us any other way, and that people wrote a lot of things about connoisseurship in the Ming, and some of it was quite derogatory of others, right? He copies, he doesn't know good paintings, he doesn't know this and that. But if we really look at what people were signing and what they were creating and how that circulated, I think we can learn a lot more about periods of time like the late Ming and what was going on through the art that we can't, obviously, in other ways.
So while we are still waiting, audience questions. So please, audience, please feel free to share a question. Don't be shy. We have art historian here. We also have some graduate students. Okay, we have one. We have an audience called Kai Wen, right? And our project assistant, please help us unmute him.
Hi.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the the wonderful lecture, Professor Kindall. And I'd like to ask. Well, have you considered, have you been familiar with a media historian, Giuliana Bruno's theorization of a concept called emotion, with the E being bracketed, that refers to the corporeal motion effect rooted in the space and place, which actually contributed to the 19th century display culture, the architecture, and later cinema, in fact. And of course, she talked about this in sort of European or North American context. But I mean, your studies really remind me of this similar techniques or strategies of reorganizing the sites and trajectories of journey according to the artist's experiential knowledge, the memory, the motion, the effect, and maybe ethical and ethnical and social cultural commitment. And I think so. I'm thinking about maybe you have considered like this is like maybe a universal or a transnational approach to this kind of a topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaiwan. I have heard that name, but I must admit to you, I have not read that particular scholar in detail. And I certainly would love to promote the idea that this, this is a transnational idea and can be applied. Certainly, the concept could be applied, I think, to a variety of topics and art. But I would want to I guess I would want to give it some time. I feel like as a kind of a mid-level scholar, I would want to see much more art and compare, you know, to understand these geo-narratives, as I'm calling them. It took a lot of time immersing myself in, you know, the geography itself, even though, of course, there are some challenges to that, and then reading or becoming familiar with what people would have been reading and thinking about going to the sites, looking at other versions of the sites. And so because it is, I felt it was such kind of an arduous process putting together how people might just view the paintings I was examining. I wouldn't want to throw that onto other cultures, other narrative traditions, willy-nilly. But I love the idea, and I hope you'll get on that and get back to me, would you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's very inspiring. Yeah, thank you.
All right, audience, we welcome your question. So while we are still waiting, let me ask another question then. I've been thinking about the conditions of producing such an artist who is capable of utilizing painting, specifically the depictions of different location, places, geography to produce a narrative. So one condition seems to me that is that the artist, he needs to be very able to write as well, maybe, or at least has a sense or have some sort of literary practice, because to narrate, the idea of narration itself somehow involves time, which I think artists or maybe writer is compared to visual artists able to do a better job to conceive the idea of narrating a story or articulating a message through time-based medium. And also when you were showing us some of the album leaves or some of the details, I was so impressed by the way Huang Xiangjian is able to articulate a sense of danger, specific, you know, motifs like the native people, the depiction of elephant, or the constructions, a particular sense of geography or spatial construction, go back to the theme of our book talk. So he's very capable, you know, the idea of specific choosing which scene to produce somehow also demonstrate a kind of literary, you know, knowledge as well. So I was wondering whether in your research we are able to discover any, maybe for instance, first painting that he created before he departing on this journey. So the prehistory of his geo-narrative work after he came back from Yunnan. And secondly, you have also talked about in your book some of the texts he has written, right? So if you can elaborate more about his literary practice, that would be helpful.
All right, pre-journey paintings, there are only two that are extant. One is an album that's in a private collection, and the other is a fan, also in a private collection. You know, both of them are perfectly lovely works, and you see kind of the rumblings of his style. You know, a very strong diagonal is available, is readily visible in both of them, and they have that kind of very strong brushwork of the dian, and he creates a lovely wash, and then places the brushwork of trees and so forth over the wash. So a lot of elements of his style are already there in those early works, but he does have a bit of it seems like almost kind of an epiphany by seeing this spectacular scenery that was pointed out by Lupin, right? There was this moment that it seems like that he kind of was struck and then never went back, you know, in his artistic career. So it seems as though, as with several artists, say Wang Lu and his paintings of Mount Hua, where these artists went into a specific geographical area and were so overwhelmed that it did affect their painting. And I've always wondered about that, you know, in them saying that they were affected, at least Kathleen Liscombe argues that not only was Wang De affected, but it really kind of had him create an entire new painting method for himself, right? And explain that, you know, to readers in a narrative that he created of his painting style. So I think it's that combination of the journey itself and being kind of overwhelmed with the landscape, and then the need to create paintings and tell the story when he got back for very very specific and fundamental, you know, livelihood purposes, and all of that worked together for him to create these wonderful paintings. As far as narrative is concerned, I would say that, you know, it is interesting, and I was a bit concerned about using the term narrative in talking about painting, because I never want to belittle the art of painting by using a literary term. But because there was, it seemed to me, kind of a clear trajectory of what he was trying to get across in these works, and that there was this kind of final, you know, ending, conclusionary epiphany that people have. It did seem important to bring that out. And then I thought that using that term in relation to geography really made geography a player and gave it an active movement, you know, within the painting, active role. So his narratives per se are pretty much travel diaries. You know, there's not a lot of writing that is, I would say, particularly eloquent or wonderful. You know, when I first started translating this, I sat and translated it, and I would take sections of it to work with John Dardis, some great historian of Ming Dynasty history. And he would say, well, this is just a nice, simple little diary. You should have no trouble reading this. You know, he talked about it as a very kind of a plain type of a writing. But in a way, there's a real beauty to that, in that he very, very succinctly says, we were traveling along in the palanquin and a tiger jumped out in front of my mother, and the palanquin bears ran away in fear. And so it's very, you know, immediate. And so in some ways his writing is very much like his painting, very immediate, very active, you know. And so in that way, you know, the diaries, I think, are quite wonderful. I would say that if anyone was the writer, it was his father. There is one particular colophon by Huang Xiangjian on one of his paintings that is no longer extant. And Huang Xiangjian is seeing the painting. It's really quite a sad story. After his son has died, he died before his father. And his father says, in looking at the painting, I saw all of the blood and the tears of the journey again. And he has this very, very melancholic feel, very sad, tragic loss, you know, that just aches through the words. So in a way, I think his father was more of the narrator. And I certainly see the entire Huang family as working together in this campaign, because a lot of these people were his father's friends. So has that answered your question on the narrative capacities of Xiangjian?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah, that's
okay,
helpful.
good.
So now we have two questions from the audience. Let me read the first one, and my colleague will read the second one. So the first one is about the question of reception over time. Thank you for the fascinating talk. How was Huang Xiangjian received in later times, for instance, 18th, 19th, or 20th century? Were there any later artists who were inspired by his geo-narrative paintings?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Wei Tian. You always have excellent questions. You know, I wish I could say he had been more inspiring. There's a later Huang that is kind of an outlier, and it's way past that 5-year mark. And it looks as though it's signed Huang Xiangjian, but it looks like it's in a very kind of it looks like a Qing painting. It looks as though Huang has made this leap to Qing painting. It could be one of the 4 Wangs, you know, and it's kind of striking in that way. And I was unsure if Huang did paint later, but he was just not, those paintings were not saved. And so it doesn't seem as though he painted later, or that other people particularly copied him, until I think, you know, people started to become interested in his story as he gained more momentum after the campaign and the play and all of that. And there are several copies that are signed Huang Xiangjian, but I believe them to be copies. They have kind of a crystalline, very, I would say, a Qing dynasty style. They're in the same Huang compositions, but they are not by Huang. It is a different painter. And so in that sense, he was well received whenever those were done, 18th or 19th or 20th centuries, as thinking that he would either make money on the market or something of that nature, or maybe someone was just copying him because they were inspired by him and wished to continue his story. But I haven't seen other artists that particularly seem to have been inspired by him, which is a pity.
Okay. Second, Zhu Pingyan has two questions, actually. The first one is, I wonder if you have talked about why Huang chose to depict the return journey instead of the other way around. And the second, also, how would you characterize the relationship between the viewer and the painting? It seems to me that the viewers were expected to be immersed in the landscape, and that the boundary between the material and the body is radically erased.
Mm-hmm. Those are great. Thank you, Pingyan, for those questions. Huang does depict both the journey there to Yunnan on his own and the journey home. And those are mixed together in the albums. And I think this too was very much a part of the campaign. Huang Xiangjian was filial, but Huang Qiangjian was loyal. And together they form the perfect unit. And so that is why, you have to have them both, because Huang goes out and he brings his parents back, but his father is loyal enough not only to have served under the Ming, but then to return all the way back to Suzhou, to his, the land where he was born, to serve and then to die. So I think was part of the campaign that it's the full package of the Huang family, father and son, filial and loyal. And that is the way that they are described by colophonists. They are compared to other fathers and sons who didn't make it, who died, or a father who went out to, or who didn't hear from his sons, or sons who went out to find their fathers who had been killed in the conflict. And so the Huangs were this amazing example of good prevailing, and the upright family that stands as an example for all. They were two sides of the tally, as it said, right? So that's the answer to your first question. The second, the viewer in the painting, yes, I think it really is interesting. I would say that the ink albums that were made, I'm arguing for the campaign, those I see as very much the viewers outside of the work, right? You're looking into the work, and you're seeing this little vignette, this little snapshot, right, of what happened. I loved the description of it, the storyboard, right? And that really is what it is, it's this kind of storyboard of the narrative that you kind of put together. It's not this chronological journey. It's here they are being loyal and filial all over the place, right? But you're outside watching that. And there are a lot of sections of landscape that cut you off from that, or you're looking up high and Huang's way up there, or he's down low and you see him crossing a river. You're watching the action, in trepidation. You're not a part of it. Whereas the blue and green hand scrolls and that large Dianan album, that I think pulls you in. That I think, because it was, as I'm arguing for Kong Jiao, you look at that and you're in it, you're part of it, right? You go into the distance, you come back forward. As you look at some of the paintings in the Dianan album, the inscriptions look as though they've been written on the side. They're kind of sliding down the side of the cliff face, so as though you're kind of on the cliff face looking at them, right, as they slide down the side. You see Huang in those paintings that are in the blue and green style, but then you also see the distant views, right, that you would see in the landscape. So I completely agree. I think that the boundary disappears in those because they are a very different type of painting for a very different purpose for Dad, right? It's his father. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I have a really quick question to wrap up everything. So because as I said, I'm not sure if during Huang's time, it is common to write down the names of these monuments or mountains and landscape, natural landscape on an artwork, because that really makes me wonder about the boundary or the relation between map and the painting at that time. Because I think in a long time of we will also have Professor Timothy Brooke talk about the map making. So I'm really curious to know whether at Huang's time or in his painting, this blurring of the boundary of a map and the painting is intended, or if not, or I don't know. I just want to know the context. So yeah, very quickly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very quickly, I would say that I think in the Ming, it was there were a number of painters that did label different geographical places within their work. We have at least one example from the Yuan dynasty as well. And I think, this is something that Julia Orell is thinking about a lot. She works on paintings of the Yangtze River, and we see those in the Song dynasty. And are they maps? Are they paintings? But in the end, it's on silk or paper. They're painting it, and so I think that there is and they're using painterly. They're making painterly choices. So because they're labeled, the geography plays a part, and understanding that part within the painting, I think, is what we need to do. I think that a viewer looking at them would read them as a painting, because maps have a slightly, they had different purposes, they were looked at in different contexts and so forth. So I would say quickly that yes, there are differences, but artists such as Chen Gu and other painters such as that, they did label paintings. And just to see, and I'm sure you know this, but Dr. Flora Fu has written so much about paintings of the Ming, and kind of sets you up for that, understanding that, and particularly in reference to mountains, and can give you more ideas about that as well. So I think I think I should stop because you said very quickly, and so that's what I'll do.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. Yeah.
Sure.